Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth.
I truly believe that thoughts are the greatest vehicle to change.
We do not care whether the cat is black or white, as long as it can catch mice.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
Creating a nation requires the will of the people, is a quote from Sir Edmund Barton, the statesman, barrister and jurist who served as the first Prime Minister of Australia. I thought this was a fitting quote for our guest today, someone who has had the privilege of leading the nation, following the will of the people in Australia's 44th federal election. Our guest today is the Honourable Tony Abbott AC, who served as the 28th Prime Minister of Australia. He was the member for Warringah in the Australian Parliament from 1994 to 2019, was Leader of the Opposition from 2009 to 2013, and during the Howard government served as a Cabinet Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations, as well as Health and Ageing. Currently, Tony is a Director of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation, serves on the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and is an advisor to the UK Board of Trade. He is a patron to several charities, including Soldier On, the International Sports Promotion Society, and the Worldwide Support for Development. And in 2022, he was conveyed with the Grand Cordon of the Order of the Rising Sun. Hello and welcome to another episode of No Limitations, a show where we speak to elite world-class performing men and women and unlock the secrets and influences that have shaped their destinies and that you could apply to your own life. For our first-time listeners from all over the world, please don't forget to follow on your preferred podcast platform and share with your friends and colleagues. And for our listeners in South Africa, India and Brazil, a big hello. I am your host, Greg Robinson, Managing Partner of Blenheim Partners, Board and Executive Search Firm. In a wide-ranging discussion, we unpack Tony's thoughts on the current state of Australia, its leadership and standing on the world stage, and where he sees society heading. From the debate in Australia leading up to the referendum and the cost of living crisis, to the ongoing conflicts overseas and shifts in the power balance. We discuss his concerns for the country and the world at large. Finally, we uncover his thoughts on leadership and how it starts with oneself. So sit back and enjoy Knowing Your Own Mind. Tony, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Greg.
The Prime Minister is the number one role in the land. Are you ever prepared well enough before you accept that role?
There's a sense in which no one is ever fully prepared for that role, but then there are lots of things in life that you can never really prepare for. I think most of us aren't really prepared for marriage. We're not really prepared for parenthood, but we give it the best shot we can, given everything that's gone before. I was lucky in that I'd had 4 years as opposition leader,
Yep.
and I think there are no better preparations for being Prime Minister than being opposition leader, because you've obviously thought about government, you've obviously thought about what changes you want to make, and you've obviously spent a lot of time trying to discern the mood of the nation. So look, I think I was as well prepared as anyone. I guess what I didn't really anticipate, at least back in 2013, was that we would then do to ourselves what Labor had done to itself in its previous term of government. But that's not something that you can ever prepare yourself for.
No, you can't. Key elements then. Leading an opposition, it's a leadership role. Forming government, it's a different role. So you're leading the party and you're leading the country. Where's the real big differences there? As you say, you've done the prep.
Yeah.
Now you're driving the car.
Leading the opposition, you're leading a tribe. Leading the nation is obviously a bit different. And the opposition leader is the leader of a tribe, the Prime Minister is the leader of the nation. And so there is a sense in which you've got to be able to reach out beyond your natural supporters, not to surrender your principles or to change who you are, but you've just got to be conscious of the fact that you are leading a nation, and the job of the national leader, as far as possible, is to keep the country together.
So what actually is leadership, Tony, in your views?
Leadership is, first of all, knowing your own mind. And if you're going to be a leader, you've got to know your own mind about what should change. So you've got to know your own mind about what's changed for the better. And then you've got to be able to assemble good arguments for the change you think is needed. And then you've got to be able to win people over to the change and the arguments. So there's, I suppose, a self-knowledge. There's a knowledge of the entity that you want to lead. And there's, I guess, a reasonable degree of familiarity with human nature and what appeals to people.
Ultimately, Cabinet is a team. How do you develop a team, a really good team?
You've got to give them something that they can all get stuck into, because everyone in the Cabinet needs to have a real job where he or she can make a difference. And then they've got to feel that there is a collective job where collectively they can make a difference. So you really need to give every senior minister a portfolio task, and then you need to have a governmental task. Now, I actually thought in my 2 years as PM we had plenty on our plate. We had the boats to stop at first. We had the budget to repair. We had various taxes to repeal. We had a whole lot of nation-building programs, particularly infrastructure. We had things that we could do to improve the microeconomy, the deregulation agenda, the trade agenda, and so on. So look, individually and collectively, I think the Abbott government had plenty to be going on with. Sadly, we were to some extent derailed by the different personal agendas and ambitions inside that government.
Now, that's a part of leadership. One part of leadership is securing it.
Mm-hmm.
The second part is keeping it.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't keep it.
No.
So what did you learn?
Well, look...
and it's a different battlefield, your battlefield, than most?
Correct. Look, in the end, circumstance is incredibly important. Often that's the key factor. Napoleon reckoned that the one thing he wanted in his generals was luck. And I suppose some leaders are luckier than others. Yeah, it's true that the harder you work, the luckier you get. But nevertheless, I certainly don't think I could have worked harder than I did. But I guess I was there at a time when perhaps society was moving to the left, and I'm certainly more on the right, in inverted commas, myself. Yeah. And there was a lot going on inside the parliamentary party in terms of people with their own personal agendas. Now, one thing that I've got to say I did come to appreciate a lot more, having my own experience as leader, was the contribution that Peter Costello made to the great strength of the Howard government. Now, obviously, John Howard was a great leader, arguably our best ever Prime Minister. He had a long time at the top, and in that time he made quite a significant difference. But he had in Peter Costello a lieutenant who was not only extremely able, but had the character to keep his own personal leadership ambitions, which were considerable, nevertheless under check. And I didn't have that experience, and I think that makes a difference. We all look back on the Great War, for instance, and we think, wow, what a wonderful general John Monash turned out to be. But, you know, I dare say that there were people killed on the first day at Gallipoli who may well have been just as good generals. And interestingly, a name that almost none of us remember today, General William Holmes, today known really only through General Holmes Drive down there near Mascot, General William Holmes was arguably as good a general as Monash, but he was killed not long after the Battle of Messines by a stray shell burst while he was leading the then New South Wales Premier William Holman on a tour of the front lines. So look, there are all these personal qualities that you should try to develop if you are to be an effective leader. But in the end, circumstance makes a massive difference, for better or for worse.
Henry Kissinger's just released a book, aptly called, I think it's Leadership. He identifies several prominent leaders: Adenauer, Charles de Gaulle, Sadat, Thatcher, Lee Kuan Yew, Richard Nixon, and their styles for the time. If you're looking at Australia today, what's the style of leadership do you think we're seeking?
Well, they were all very different leaders, and I'm not super familiar with all of them. But
they were for their time, but weren't they?
True. I suppose the most important thing for a leader, a political leader, is to have an analysis of the time that makes sense. Now, Thatcher's analysis was that Britain had become economically sclerotic and it needed to be substantially reformed. Nationalised industries needed to be privatised. Inefficient companies couldn't be propped up. Overmighty unions needed to be controlled. The armed forces needed to be sustained. The police needed to be supported. Traditional institutions needed to be built up. And given that morale was low and Britain self-evidently was performing very, very much subpar in the late 1970s, she turned out to be a leader for the times. Interestingly, she could have become a one-term prime minister, but for the Falklands War, which transformed her standing. I mean, maybe she was always going to win against the then opposition leader, Michael Foot, who was a great orator but an incorrigible lefty. But nevertheless, there was a lot of dissension in her cabinet. And if you read Charles Moore's excellent biography of Margaret Thatcher, the volume 1 is fascinating. The extent of the dissent in the ranks and the amount of, I suppose, briefing against her was pretty incredible. I guess at that point in time, there was really no one person who was able to crystallise opposition to her. But it was actually a pretty turbulent time. It's only in retrospect that these things look as smooth sailing as they do.
Yeah, but we're going into some pretty turbulent times now. We've got the Northern Hemisphere. We've got issues on their own backyard. What does a nation look for in leadership?
Well, one thing that I think the Albanese government deserves praise for is building on the AUKUS decision of the Morrison government. And I think that the program that the government has come up with to have, first of all, British and American nuclear submarines based here, then to buy 3 or more nuclear submarines from the Americans, then to build them here in conjunction with the British, I think that's a good scheme.
Okay.
Now, it's one thing to have a good scheme. It's another thing to make it happen, given the difficulties of the defence bureaucracy. But nevertheless, all credit to the Albanese government for that. I'm not nearly as impressed by the Albanese government when it comes to domestic policy, as I dare say people are starting to work out. I think that this voice is a thoroughly bad move. We're all in favour of Indigenous recognition, but this isn't about recognition. This is about transforming the way we governed. It will gum up government. It will entrench race in our constitution in, I think, a very destructive way. And it's going to entrench Indigenous separatism, which again I think is at the heart of the problem of dysfunction in remote Indigenous Australia. So the voice, I think, is a big step backwards. I think the government's energy policy is almost insane, but they're very much set on it. And I fear what we're witnessing is a slow motion train wreck.
Just on the voice, Why is it getting so much support so quickly then? Why are Australians just saying yes without necessarily doing their full due diligence?
I think that there's an enormous goodwill towards Aboriginal people, and the government is pushing this forward under false pretences. It's saying that it's just about listening to Aboriginal people. Well, we've been listening to Aboriginal people very intently for the best part of the last half century. This isn't about listening. This is about trying to ensure that no serious decisions of government can be made without a substantial Indigenous input. Now, some people think that's a great idea. I happen to think that it's wrong, that under 4% of the population should have an effective veto over decisions that are being made for 100% of the population. I just think that's dead wrong. But the government is doing its best to ensure that we don't think about this and that the whole thing gets carried through on a tide of goodwill. Now, what I'm trying to do and what others are trying to do is to alert people to the dangers of the fine print and the fact that this is much, much more than the government is letting on.
And just on leadership, Tony, do you think the average Australian is taking a genuine interest in what political leaders are actually saying these days, or has a large majority absolutely just turned off?
In a country that's doing well, and whatever areas we might currently be deficient in, Australia is still by far the best place in the world to live.
Yep.
Look, in a country which is doing well, particularly a country which has done so well for so long, I think people do tend to turn off politics. Happy the country that need not fret too much about its politics. The countries where people obsess about politics are normally the countries that have been racked by civil war, revolution, upheaval, disaster. We've had over 2 centuries of pretty damn good evolutionary progress. So most people really, they think about politics, if at all, at election time, and apart from that, they'd rather get on with following the footy and try to have a better job and a better life and making sure their kids are doing as well as possible and so on. So look, people are not very switched on, but this particular change, this voice, is a forever change, and that's why people should not lightly make it and why they should study it very carefully before they say yes.
Are you worried about the forum of debate, i.e. cancel culture?
I think that's a real problem. I think that throughout the Western world, but particularly in the Anglosphere, we're in danger of losing the ability to disagree civilly. I also think that we're becoming more fragmented and polarised, and social media and artificial intelligence curating people's news feeds and so on are contributing very substantially to that. Once upon a time, we had more common experiences. We tended to read newspapers, for instance. We tended to watch nightly news, and mainstream media organisations normally feel a need for at least a degree of balance. But if you're getting a curated social media feed, it's going to just give you the stuff that you agree with. It's going to reinforce your existing views, your existing prejudices, if you like. And I think that's one of the reasons why these days, if you disagree with someone, the tendency is not just to think that that person is wrong, but that they're bad as well, not just misguided, but arguably immoral. And I think this is a real problem.
You're listening to No Limitations with special guest Tony Abbott, AC. On our next episode, I sit down with Kate Munnings, Chief Executive Officer of Virtus Health.
1 in 6 couples struggle to get pregnant. Like, we grow up as young people thinking we are frightened of getting pregnant. What happens if we get pregnant, particularly in times gone by? Yeah. But actually getting pregnant is getting more difficult.
Be sure to join us on our next episode. And now, back to the show. Mum and Dad from England?
Dad was a POM. He came to Australia as a 16-year-old because his father came to Australia to work in the BHP fleet just before the Second World War. So Dad was a POM who'd become an Australian. He served in the Australian Air Force during the war. He went through university on an ex-service scholarship, then went to England to study orthodontics, which in those days you couldn't study in Australia. Mum was an Australian girl doing the London thing. They met, they got married. I was born in England. My sister was born in England. Family came back to Australia and lived happily ever after. Pretty simple story.
University of Sydney, why did you choose law and economics?
I chose law and economics because I thought that it would be a good preparation for life.
Hedging your bets?
I didn't particularly want to be a lawyer, but I thought that a law degree would be helpful. I guess even as an 18-year-old, I had some vague thoughts of being in public life. When I was at university, I got heavily involved in student politics.
Yep.
I became a part-time and occasional journalist for the Bulletin and for the Australian and for other publications. I had 3 years training for the priesthood when I came back from Oxford, so that was something that was in the back of my mind as a youngster growing up. But I worked out after 3 years in a seminary environment that I was a square peg in a round hole, went into journalism, and then eventually into politics.
You said you're always going to retain an Oxford cast of mind. What does that mean?
Well, the great thing about the Oxbridge method is that as an undergraduate, you basically have 2 tutorials a week, and you've got 2 to 2.5 days a week in which to assimilate what you've been assigned to read, make what you will of it, and then credibly and as intelligently as you can distill your own thinking into an essay that can pass muster with someone who is a serious expert in the field. So look, it's fabulous training. Oxbridge is fabulous training for in particular, journalism, law, politics, and public administration, because you've got to get on top of difficult and complex issues quickly, and you've got to be able then to credibly advocate in that field. So I was incredibly lucky to have that 2 years in Oxford.
They're not a bad boxer as well?
I was talked into being a boxer by the person who turned out to be my best mate in England. He was the ultimate muscular Christian. He was an American Jesuit scholastic by the name of Paul Mankowski, sadly no longer with us. But one night in late January, it was the beginning of the second term, I was having a few start-of-term beers with Paul. At 9 o'clock in the evening, he said, "Tony, we're a bit late on for a heavyweight at the boxing club. Why don't you come down and try out?" I said no. A couple of beers later, I said yes. Went down feeling sheepish the next day, went through the motions, decided that I was going to come down the following day and tell him I was too busy playing rugby and I couldn't do it. But Paul had noticed the previous day that I had trouble finding a skipping rope that fit. So he'd gone out and bought me a skipping rope. And of course, for a Jesuit who took poverty seriously, spending 10 quid on a skipping rope was quite a big deal. And once he gave me the skipping rope, I didn't have the heart to quit. So I went on and I had 4 fights in Oxford, won all of them in knockouts. But as I kept saying, they were POMs, and, put an Australian in a ring with a POM. And what do you
Well, the big one was against Cambridge, wasn't it?
I had two bouts against Cambridge, and they were both first-round knockouts.
When you were studying, and obviously, as you said, you contemplated a public life, who did you admire in politics in those days?
Well, I think like every English-speaking person interested in public life, the supreme politician was obviously Winston Churchill. But I guess there are others who are appealing. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was obviously a great political leader. George Washington, whatever you think of the rights and wrongs of the American War of Independence, was obviously a significant leader in this country. For someone who was a natural liberal, Menzies was a great leader. And I think even then, in the early 80s, Howard was developing as a very substantial politician. After B.A. Santa Maria, the most important political mentor that I had was John Howard. And I had the great privilege of serving in his cabinet for something like 8 years, and you learn a lot from a Prime Minister who you serve in cabinet with.
So, Tony, if you were going to look back at a young man at university today, who would you admire in politics around the world today?
Well, again, I think looking back a generation, Thatcher and Reagan were great role models.
But today it's tough, isn't it?
It's tougher. In my time as PM, the most impressive leaders I worked with were Narendra Modi and Shinzo Abe, both of them transformative leaders of their country. I had a very good relationship with David Cameron, the then British Prime Minister, with Stephen Harper, the then Canadian Prime Minister, and with John Key, the then New Zealand Prime Minister. We were, if you like, the four chums, if you like, all being from the centre-right of politics and getting on well. But the traditional Anglosphere has been in the doldrums for the last couple of decades. This hasn't been a time when America has covered itself with glory.
Nope.
I think Brexit is a great opportunity for Britain, but it's been a very divisive business, and arguably no leader thus far in Britain has been able to fully make the most of it. Rishi Sunak is coming on well. He's still got a hell of a job ahead of him. But if Rishi Sunak can manage to pull off the unwinnable election, and I think there's a chance he might, he could turn out to be a transformative leader. But as I said, in my time, the two outstanding leaders by far, at least democratic leaders, were Narendra Modi and Shinzo Abe.
So when you became opposition leader in 2009, what was morale like?
It was low. We were all completely flummoxed by the defeat of the Howard government because we had thought that the Howard government had done a very good job. So look, morale was low. Then Malcolm's own leadership was problematic because in the end he wanted us to agree with the Labor Party on a very, very contentious policy, the emissions trading scheme. Energy policy has been, I guess, an area of enormous contention in this country for the last couple of decades.
Time lost, doesn't it?
Bit like Europe for Britain in recent times, a bit like Ireland for Britain 100 years or so back. Well, I think we are lost. We are lost. And the problem is that in order to reduce emissions, we are committing a major act of economic self-harm. Now, the difficulty is that, in part, I'm sure, because of lefty brainwashing at school, more and more young people seem to think that we are headed for an environmental climate apocalypse. And yet people are quite evangelical, theological about this, hence the obsession with renewable energy. But you cannot run a modern industrial economy on renewable power. The one way to run a modern industrial economy with zero emissions is nuclear.
Yep.
And yet the same green movement which is obsessing over renewables is absolutely, they regard nuclear as unthinkable. So, as I said, I think this is a slow motion train wreck that's coming. Eventually, when we have to choose between reducing emissions and keeping the lights on, we will decide to keep the lights on, but we're going to do ourselves a lot of damage in the meantime.
Is opposition putting up a strong enough argument?
I think that the
they might put in the argument up, but they're not winning the hearts and minds.
Well, let's see. They may not be winning the hearts and minds now, but once the lights start flickering, I think it'll be different.
So the ability to communicate and get the message out. Reagan was one of the best.
Mm-hmm.
What did you learn from your experience as PM in getting a message out?
Well, you've got to know what the message is. That's the important thing. You've got to know what the message is, and you've got to be completely focused and relentless in getting it out there. And I think I was quite good at that.
Yep.
I don't think anyone was under any illusions about what the government was trying to do when I was PM. I think it was very clear what the government was trying to do. Now, not everyone agreed with it, including some people inside the government, but nevertheless, I don't think there was any lack of clarity.
You were surprised by the result when you won?
No, I thought that we would surprise people in 2010, and we came within a whisker of victory. We effectively won the election only to lose the negotiation.
Yeah.
I thought we would win convincingly in 2013, which we did. So no, I wasn't surprised at all.
What did you set out to achieve?
Well, I set out to do what we kept saying, to the point where journalists could repeat the mantra: stop the boats, axe the taxes, fix the budget, build the roads. And in fact, we did all those things. Fixing the budget was a bit problematic because we had to get a lot of legislation through the Senate, and the Senate was deeply obstructive. And there were some issues with building the roads. The Victorian government changed, and the East-West link, which to this day Melbourne is crying out for, was cancelled, even though $1 billion had already been spent to start it. I thought it was truly bizarre that a government would spend $1 billion not to build a road, but there we are. Andrew's government in Victoria seems to have defied political gravity in all sorts of ways. So the other thing that I was keen to do in that first term was set up in government an ongoing economic reform program. And that was what the Federation Reform and Tax Reform white papers were supposed to do. They were supposed to give us credible blueprints for which we could seek a mandate at the 2016 election. Now, unfortunately, when I was rolled, those processes were terminated. My successor, very able man, but my successor wasn't keen on the things that I was keen on, and the Green Army, the Japanese Submarine Alliance, the tax and federation reform processes, the free trade deal with India were just some of the things that got scrubbed in the immediate aftermath of the change of leadership.
If you look back, Tony, what would you have changed?
Look, it was an incredible privilege to lead the party for 6 years. It was a great honour to lead the country for 2 years. There are a couple of things that I wish I'd been able to do. I'm very sorry that the submarine partnership with Japan didn't come off, because had it come off, we would be getting our next generation of submarines about now, rather than having to wait another 15 years for the first of the AUKUS subs to roll off. Nevertheless, given that the French sub deal was never a good idea, I think that we now finally are on the right track. I just wish we were much further down the road. With the wisdom of hindsight, we shouldn't have abolished the debt ceiling at the end of 2013, because that would have ensured a lot more fiscal discipline than we've seen, even though the Morrison government did eventually get back to a position of budget balance. We're now way behind when it comes to budgetary discipline and fiscal responsibility. People will say that I shouldn't have knighted Prince Philip. I think that it was only a question of timing. Had Prince Philip been knighted at death's door, I think everyone would have cheered, given the affection that we suddenly all had for him once we were on the verge of losing him. So look, in the end, I did the best I could. Circumstances played out as they did, and I just have to accept that it was what it was.
So for the benefit of those people out there who haven't been Prime Minister, what's it like as a job?
It's incredibly exhilarating, but it's deeply stressful. It's the most wonderful privilege anyone can have to lead their country, particularly a country which has as much going for it as we do here in Australia. But it is very stressful because in the end, the things that come onto the Prime Minister's desk are the very difficult decisions. If it's an easy decision, it's not a problem. It's only the hard ones that, in the end, Prime Ministers have to decide.
If you could wave your magic wand, Tony, now standing back, you've had all this experience. Federation.
Mm-hmm.
Would you still have it?
Look, it was wonderful that the 6 colonies came together as one indissoluble federal commonwealth under the Crown. It might have been good if we'd inserted somewhere in that preamble with an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character, but at the time we didn't think to do that. But look, given that we had 6 separate colonies, Australia was always going to be a federation. Federations have strengths and weaknesses. Look at the United States, look at Canada, look at India, for instance, which is also a federation. The strength of a federation is that it can accommodate diversity. The weakness of a federation is that it can make government on a day-to-day basis more difficult because you've got to get more ducks lined up to get serious things done. But so far, as a federation, we've been able to rise to all of the challenges that have been thrown up at us, and let's hope that continues to be the case.
The reason I raised the question, I thought as a nation, we got pretty selfish state by state through COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And the Federation, to me, started showing us some of its gaps. And if we had the chance, would we, look at the inefficiencies of Federation. We're only a small country, 27 million. Does it make sense? Will it ever be tampered with or not?
Look, I thought that COVID was a deeply dispiriting period in the life of this country and indeed of the wider world. And it depressed me deeply, the way we became a collection of squabbling states shut off against each other for months and months at a time. I actually think that it could have been handled differently. I think that under the existing Biosecurity Act, the federal government could, had it chosen, taken national control of the whole situation, but for a whole host of reasons it decided not to, and with the wisdom of hindsight, I think that was a mistake.
International? How are we playing our game on the international?
Obviously, the thing that most matters is the war in Ukraine, and I think we should be doing more to help the Ukrainians to win. I think they're fighting for the freedom of everyone, not just themselves. One of the many reasons why it's important that the Ukrainians win is because anything other than a clear defeat for Putin will embolden President Xi and the Beijing regime to have a go at Taiwan. The disruptions, the difficulties, the dangers of the war in Ukraine are mild and minimal compared to the catastrophe that would be a Chinese attack on Taiwan and the ramifications that would have for the wider world.
So where do you see Australia's role in the Asia Pacific?
Our role is to be as strong as we can and to work as closely as we can with our democratic partners. The American alliance is critical. The increasing military partnership with Japan is critical. The growing strategic tie-up with India is critical. The democracies have to stand together if we want the next 50 years to be as good as the last.
Will America really come to our aid?
America will continue to do its best.
Now, what does that mean?
To stand up for democratic freedoms.
Yeah.
But America's relative position in the world is not what it was, and America is more polarised and fragmented than it has been for a long time. And I think that the quality of political leadership in America right now is not what we might hope for.
Well, you look at what the Arabs are doing as well in the Middle East. They're signing up into Africa in partnership with China. You've got Brazil now having China in there as well. Is America losing its space on the world
I think
on the map?
I think...
Or its influence?
I don't think there would be any country on earth that wouldn't prefer to do a deal with the United States than with China. But China is able to do underhand things for the benefit of corrupt elites in other countries, which the Western countries, particularly the Anglosphere countries, for all sorts of good reasons can't do. I mean, look at what China's done in the Solomon Islands. I mean, China has essentially bought the Solomon Islands Parliament. China has bribed its way to a position of influence in the Solomon Islands, it's effectively a form of financial conquest that's going on there. We can't match that, so we've got to find decent ways of winning hearts and minds in countries like that.
But how do we do that, Tony? That's the challenge, isn't it?
I'm more than happy to have that conversation with the people of authority, but I don't pretend that it's easy.
What's the greatest concerns on your mind at the moment for Australia?
My greatest concerns are that we will needlessly divide ourselves and establish a thoroughly corrosive element of race in our constitution via this voice referendum, and that our misguided climate evangelism is going to do very deep economic damage to our country.
Tony, if you were to look back at that young man going to university, the world in front of him, what advice would you give him now?
Have a go.
On that, Tony, thank you very much for joining us today.
Good on you, Greg.
You've been listening to No Limitations.